I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respect to elders, past, present and emerging. And I also acknowledge those members of the stolen generations who have joined us in here. I had the great honour of spending time with you this morning at the National Apology Breakfast. Your presence humbles us and it elevates us. The apology was the very first order of business of the Rudd Labor government. There are many moments I'm proud of as a parliamentarian, but that extraordinary day, 16 years ago, remains my proudest. And amid the catharsis that it made possible, it set in place the annual report card that is closing the gap. It is important to reflect on the apology and the courage and grace of the survivors who made it possible. As Prime Minister Rudd implored us that day, let us turn this page together and write this new chapter in our nation's story together. Anniversaries matter deeply, but what will shape the future is the actions we take now. 16 years after the apology, only 11 out of 19 socio-economic outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are improving. Just 4 are on track to meet their targets. What should give us pause is that outcomes have worsened for 4 critical targets: children's early development, rates of children in out-of-home care, rates of adult imprisonment, and tragically suicide. We can take some heart from the fact that in some areas that are off target, they are not uniformly so. Early childhood development, adult incarceration rates and out-of-home care aren't on track at a national level, but have shown improvement in some regions and jurisdictions. That's a positive, albeit a slender one. The Productivity Commission has made it clear that the old ways are not working. Decades of insisting that government knows best has made things worse. We must find a better way, and we must do it together. That focus was a fundamental reason our government sought to fulfil the gracious and generous request from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for a voice enshrined in our nation's constitution. Of course, we respect the referendum result. The preceding debate brought into sharp focus the disadvantage and inequality endured by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Support for reconciliation is a core value of this Labor government, and it is a value shared by Australians. Australians want to close the gap. Australians believe in the fair go. The government remains determined to move reconciliation forward and seek better results for Indigenous Australians. As we take the time needed to get Makarrata and truth-telling right, the work of treaty goes on at a state and territory level. There will be a diversity of processes reflecting the diversity of First Nations across the continent, and we will respond to their progress while focusing on our immediate responsibilities: closing the gap, self-determination and tangible outcomes, particularly in jobs, housing, education, health and justice. There have, of course, been improvements during the course of the modern Australian story. When we paid our respects to the late Dr. Lewidgha O'Donoghue last week, it was clear how much had changed during her lifetime, thanks in no small part to her. Her love for this country found its greatest expression in her faith in our ability and our will to become an even better nation. With us in the gallery today is Deb Edwards, Dr. O'Donoghue's niece and one of the keepers of her flame. Australia has overcome much, but the gaps persist, including the life expectancy gap that gapes us like a chasm. That is inexcusable. Uluru was an invitation born of grace, but grace is not a bottomless well, and we cannot ask for infinite patience. We all agreed that the status quo is unacceptable. As just one example, this is what Dr. Jason King told the ABC last year about the community he works in near Cairns. We have a rheumatic heart disease rate, a medical condition which has been eliminated from the broader Australian population to a larger extent, that is 100 times the average in this country. The ABC even had to include an explanation of rheumatic heart disease. That is how completely it has faded, not just from the general community, but from our collective memory, but not from Indigenous Australia. But we cannot keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome. Our approach has to change. Making progress depends on listening to people and communities. In the words of Tom Karma, bureaucrats and governments can have the best intentions in the world, but if their ideas have not been subject to the reality test of the life experience of the local Indigenous peoples who are intended to benefit from this, then government efforts will fail. That is why we are listening to and working with communities. The government is committed to the ongoing National Agreement on Closing the Gap. We are determined to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to create new opportunities and achieve better outcomes at a local level. We must deliver real jobs with real skills, which means real opportunity for First Nations people. That is why we are moving on from the failed community development program. It created no real opportunities. It built no futures. Today I announce the creation of our Remote Jobs and Economic Development Program. This is a better approach. It will fund community organisations to create 3,000 jobs in remote areas. Real jobs with proper wages and decent conditions. Jobs developed in partnership with Indigenous communities. Jobs that will build skills that communities want. Jobs that deliver services that communities want. Jobs that deliver infrastructure that communities want. Jobs that create a sense of possibility for individuals, for families and for communities. This new program will focus squarely on economic development that strengthens community and, crucially, lays the foundations for long-term positive change. The key ingredient is engagement with community organisations and communities to identify and develop local opportunities and jobs. Those organisations will also identify the right people to do those jobs and be the employer. We're also increasing the number of Indigenous rangers, which has been such a compelling success story, and developing the junior program. We want every Australian to have access to the dignity of work, that we want every job to confer dignity. As part of our focus on housing, my government has worked with the Northern Territory Government to escalate construction of remote housing in order to address the worst overcrowding rates in the country. Together, we have achieved a 200% increase in the rate of delivery of Commonwealth-funded housing, building 100 homes in 100 days in 2023. Last year, as part of Closing the Gap, we committed to building 157 houses in remote Northern Territory communities during the financial year 2023-2024. Today, I can confirm that these are on schedule to be not just completed, but be completed months early. We have also restored funding for Northern Territory homelands with housing repairs across the country, from Paru on the Tiwi Islands to Utopia in the Barkly, and vital upgrades in sanitation and electrical safety and water testing and supply. This is essential because so much of life's possibility begins with the stability and the security of somewhere to call home. We must keep going, and delivery has to be the priority. Delivery that means better health outcomes. Delivery that means stronger communities. Communities that get a say, and just as importantly, are heard. What so much of it amounts to is a simple truth, and that is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander parents want for their children is the same as all Australians want for theirs. The same opportunity to make a good life for themselves. The next generation is critical to change. So I'm pleased to announce that we are establishing a National Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. The National Commissioner will be dedicated to protecting and promoting the rights, interests and wellbeing of First Nations children and young people, as well as calling on their strengths, sense of hope and ideas for change. The Commissioner will address the unacceptable rates of out-of-home care. What it all comes down to is strengthening families and keeping children safe. It is what the coalition of peaks and experts have been calling for, guided every step of the way by the evidence, and we have listened. An interim National Commissioner will be appointed this year. They will undertake consultation with First Nations and other stakeholders on the role and functions of a legislated, independent and empowered National Commissioner. Since we were elected, the government has prioritised resourcing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations, particularly the community-controlled sector. To help end family and domestic violence, we are providing immediate assistance of $96 million in grants to frontline Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations in supporting First Nations women and children affected by violence. We will invest in justice reinvestment right across the continent as part of our landmark Justice Reinvestment Program, the largest commitment to justice reinvestment ever delivered by the Commonwealth. Justice reinvestment is a long-term, community-led approach to preventing crime, improving community safety and reducing the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults and children in custody. We have delivered on our election commitment to establish national real-time reporting of all deaths in custody. Every preventable death in custody is a tragedy, with a shockwave of trauma and grief that rocks families and entire communities. Real-time reporting will ensure we have better data from every state and territory to identify systemic failures in custodial practices and try to prevent future deaths occurring in similar circumstances. Under our health worker traineeship program, 183 students have enrolled and when they are ready will go work for Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. Through elder care support, we have funded 182 full-time equivalent positions to work as elder care support workers. Through our support for suicide prevention efforts, we now have 108 workers to drive culturally appropriate suicide prevention across country. In the area of early education, we have ensured a base entitlement of 36 hours a fortnight for First Nations children. Last year, in January to September alone, 14,000 Indigenous students enrolled in fee-free TAFE. We're improving access to safe drinking water for 1,100 people in the communities in Yuendamu and Milingimbi. We are improving renal services with an anticipated 30 dialysis units in remote areas over 4 years. After a decade of neglect, we're making a record investment of $250 million in Central Australia for a better, safer future. We are continuing to talk to the community about how effectively this rollout can be completed. I can announce that includes 7 new remote training hubs in Central Australia. One of the first ones will be in Yuendamu. And as with every other initiative, we will keep working with the community. There are no easy solutions and no quick fixes to the challenges facing Indigenous Australians in Alice Springs, but we are working with the community to deliver effective, lasting solutions. Just some of what we have done includes an increase in funding for police and youth services, expanded family and domestic violence services in remote communities outside Alice Springs, setting up a night patrol, improved health services for children and families, new dialysis centres at Tea Tree and Harts Range, increased funding and improved programs to get kids to school and keep them there, and expanded safe short-term accommodation in Alice Springs. As part of our government's Justice Reinvestment Program, Laura Tipi, Desert Knowledge Australia and Anglicare NT are developing a local response to reduce crime and increase community safety. And we upgraded Wi-Fi in 4 communities, which among other things gives teenagers opportunities to access study and training opportunities. Following the success of the community Wi-Fi trial, we're upgrading Wi-Fi in another 20 communities this year, boosting access to services and chipping away at the tyranny of distance. This will be done in partnership with NBN Co, with access delivered via the NBN Sky Muster service and in community digital ambassadors to support digital literacy. Kids should have the same access to the same digital opportunities, whether they're in Alice, Brisbane or the Kimberley. Again, this is what we can do when we listen to people in communities. While it's crucial to have built in this momentum, it's essential to keep building on it. We're also looking at some of the possibilities in the transition to renewable energy. Taking a leaf out of Canada's book, Energy Minister Chris Bowen is co-developing a First Nations clean energy strategy. There is already significant First Nations involvement in some major renewable energy investments. And as Australia moves ever closer to taking its rightful place as a clean energy superpower, the potential is exciting in job creation and in the right of Indigenous Australians to leverage benefit from their own land. Mr. Speaker, if we want to close the gap, we have to listen to people who live on the other side of it. Canberra must be willing to share power with communities, to offer responsibility and ownership and self-determination, to let local knowledge design programs, to trust locals to deliver them, and to listen to locals when they tell us what's working and what isn't. That's a culture change we have to drive in this building, in the public service and across governments at all levels. The price of failure over successive governments isn't just counted in dollars, it's measured in lives. Not every community-driven initiative will be an overnight success, but we know that we cannot just keep doing things the same way. The Productivity Commission has outlined the case for a new approach. I'm grateful for the ongoing work of the Coalition of Peaks, led so ably by Pat Turner, a great Australian, and Deputy Lead Conveners Catherine Little and Scott Wilson, for their determination to ensure the success of this endeavour. The Coalition of Peaks and the state and territory governments are vital partners in our national effort. Greater cooperation is key to meaningful, sustained progress. My government is enhanced by the wealth of wisdom and expertise of the Minister for Indigenous Australians, the member for Barton, as well as the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Australians and Assistant Minister for Indigenous Health, Senator Malarndirri McCarthy. I want to also put on record that I'm very grateful to the father of reconciliation, Pat Dodson. His absence from this place is keenly felt. I'm glad he's in the Kimberley, where his big heart belongs. And I know that I can speak on behalf of all parliamentarians in saying that we all wish him very well with his ongoing health issues that he is dealing with the same courage in which he has dealt with his extraordinary journey in life. His legacy is in the best possible hands with our First Nations caucus, who will keep building on it and carrying it forward. What they and others have done is ensure that this government listens to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, that we remain committed to Australians having a shared understanding of our history and a united vision for our future, a future shaped by self-determination. We are clear-eyed in our dedication to building an Australia where more families know the stability of a roof over their head, where communities are safer, happier and healthier, shaped and secured by the people who call them home, where more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have the same chance to have a good crack at a fulfilling life. The simple truth that can brighten the path ahead for all of us is that when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people advance, the entire nation moves forward. There is so much more that we can do, so much more that we must do. We can and we must do better than governments of all persuasions have done over the last 123 years. We keep writing the great Australian story. It is a story that goes back 65,000 years. And those of us who've either come to this nation ourselves or have come from descendants of people who have come over the last 200 plus years have the great privilege of sharing this greatest country on earth with the oldest continuous culture on earth. That must be a source of enormous pride for all Australians. It is a great Australian story, but all of us, particularly us here, have a chance to write the next chapter and to do it in the spirit of reconciliation.
For the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and offer a very warm welcome to our special guests in the gallery, our fellow Australians who are part of the Stolen Generations, members of the Coalition of Peaks, and a special welcome to Deb Edwards, Dr O'Donoghue's niece. I also acknowledge those members of the Stolen Generations and their families who will be watching this broadcast from across the nation. Today, in annual tradition, we also honour the memories of those members of the Stolen Generations and their families who are no longer with us. Strange, as the Prime Minister points out, not to have Pat Dodson here on this day as well, and we wish him all the very best with the medical issues that he confronts at the moment. Mr Speaker, 16 years ago, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the national apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples. The national apology was about Australia coming to terms with the dark chapters of our past. It was about the cold, confronting, uncomfortable truth, facing it, dealing with it, moving on from it, as Prime Minister Rudd said. But the national apology was also delivered in a spirit of optimism about Australia's future. Prime Minister Rudd spoke about a future where all Australians, whatever their origins, are truly equal partners with equal opportunities and with an equal stake in shaping the next chapter in the history of this great country. Prime Minister Rudd spoke about a new beginning. He spoke about building a bridge between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians and the importance of crossing that bridge. He spoke about going forward with confidence to embrace our future. Mr Speaker, our annual commemoration of the National Apology Anniversary is testimony to the fact that we are a mature nation. While we rightly celebrate the achievement of modern Australia, we do not forget the dark chapters of our history or fail to heed their lessons. And yet we are still far from realising that optimistic vision for Australia, which Prime Minister Rudd and each of his successors spoke about over the course of the last 16 years. These failures are not confined to a single party, a single government or a single institution. There has been no decade of failure, as the Prime Minister put before. There has been collective effort across the aisle, across administrations, across levels of government, across NGOs and across communities over the course of that period of time and for many, many decades before that. These failures are not a lack of good intent or a lack of goodwill, a lack of effort, or indeed a lack of funding. What then characterises our collective failures? Well, it is true. We've been too content to maintain approaches which we know are not working. We've made the mistake in thinking that more bureaucracy translates into better outcomes, and we've allowed some sensitivities to be prioritised ahead of the rights of the individual, whereby our authorities are afraid to act or indeed won't act. Mr Speaker, the government's announced a $707 million program to create 3,000 remote jobs over 3 years through the funding of community organisations. It's an admirable aim. Prime Ministers successively have made similar announcements, provided additional funding, talking about opportunities to grow jobs, to build houses, to address health needs, education needs in many communities, but in many situations, the aspiration has just not been achieved. The Coalition naturally wants to see more jobs available to support the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous Australians to help turn the tide of disadvantage. We've supported the government in their cause to provide more housing as a fundamental need of those in Indigenous communities and far beyond that. But we call on the government to identify the specifics of this program. It's too important to allow it to be an aspiration not achieved. From which sectors, industries and employers will these jobs come? What infrastructure is or will be put in place to support these jobs? And will that require additional funding, and if so, how much? What proportion of the $707 million will go toward communities directly into those organisations to provide support for the outcome? And what amount will go into administration of the program? Will this program include the $185 million Community Jobs and Business Fund? Will it be run from Canberra? How much autonomy will be provided to those in Indigenous leadership positions? If this is the case, will it be managed from within existing public resources, sector service resources, or will it require additional public servants here in Canberra? There are some on the other side who scoff, but these are important questions to ask, and they need to be answered, because successive Liberal and Labor administrations have offered up the same goodwill, but the outcomes, as the Prime Minister rightly points out, have not been delivered. If almost $750 million is to be spent on the program, there must be guarantees that the 3,000 jobs figure is achievable, rather than simply being a wishful target. And we want to work with the government to make sure that it is achievable. The Coalition received the last Commonwealth Closing the Gap annual report just a few hours ago. But from our cursory glance, the report, of course, reveals that while some progress has been made, we're continuing to fail our most marginalised Indigenous brothers and sisters, especially those living in remote communities, and particularly women and children. As the Prime Minister has pointed out, of the 19 socio-economic outcomes, only 4 are on track to meet their targets. As we know, in communities like Alice Springs, the news coverage continues to demonstrate that the situation on the ground remains dire. That we wouldn't talk about it or be prepared to air it in this place is part of the problem. Not much has improved, to be honest, since we were here for the 15th anniversary, or the 14th, or the ones many years before that. And there are many other places around our nation where Indigenous Australians are living unimaginable lives. Australians have voiced their burning desire to see the national situation alter. They want action. They want things to change. And indeed, all of us here want to see practical solutions implemented to close the gap. We all want to see law and order boosted, which is the very foundation of a functioning society. We all want to see school attendance and employment opportunities improved. We all want to see health outcomes enhanced. We all want to see the best opportunity available for young kids in Indigenous communities, particularly remote Indigenous communities, that they may share in the same opportunities as their city cousins. And yet we all must accept the fact that if we continue to do more of the same, we will only get more of the same. And that's why today I renew my calls for the government to implement a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse in Indigenous communities. The Prime Minister has today announced the establishment of a National Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people. The findings of a Royal Commission would certainly support the work of this National Commissioner. Furthermore, the Coalition has proposed an audit into spending on Indigenous programs. That audit is something every parliamentarian should welcome if they truly want to close the gap. We need to make sure that the money is getting into programs that will deliver support to Indigenous people on the ground. Last week, the Productivity Commission publicly released its review of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. The report notes, in most jurisdictions, it's unclear how much funding is allocated to Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and non-Indigenous, non-government organisations. And yet we know, as the Prime Minister points out, that in many of those programs, good work is being undertaken. We know that, again, despite some of the Prime Minister's earlier remarks, that many Indigenous voices are involved in program design and service delivery. In some of those programs, they have achieved significant success. In other programs, they have not. The reason for most of this is because most governments either have not undertaken or not published the expenditure reviews that they agreed to undertake. Billions of dollars, Mr Speaker, over many decades have not translated into the outcomes that Indigenous Australians deserve. Only more bureaucracy and more bottlenecks which prevent the money going where it's needed most. Mr Speaker, if we are to achieve practical improvements, then we need to take necessary and needed action which makes a difference on the ground in Indigenous communities. Only then may we begin to realise that optimistic vision for Australia which Prime Minister Rudd spoke of 16 years ago.
I'll just call the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I present a copy of my ministerial statement, the Closing the Gap Commonwealth Annual Report 2023 and the Commonwealth Implementation Plan 2024, the Coalition of Peaks Closing the Gap Implementation Plan 2024 and the Coalition of Peaks Annual Report 2022-2023.
And I call the Leader of the House.
I move that the House take note of the Prime Minister's statement on the 16th anniversary of the National Apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples and Closing the Gap Annual Report and Implementation Plan.
The question is that the House take note of the document.
I move that the debate be adjourned. Oh, sorry.
The Minister will... Yes, you're right. The question is the House take note of the document, and I give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I recognise country and recognise the care and custodianship of country and culture. I stand here before of you as the member for Barton, but also a First Nations woman from the Wiradjuri Nation. 16 years ago, one word changed our country forever: sorry. It was not about guilt or blame. It was about facing up to the true history of this nation. Above all, it was about people. People like the Stolen Generation survivors and their families who join us today. As we reflect on one of the most tragic, brutal and damaging chapters of Australia's story, the shadow of this history is cast long and falls not only on those who were taken, but through the intergenerational trauma that was unleashed in our families and communities. To those from the stolen generations and your families, I acknowledge your strength, your courage and your resilience. Thank you so much for being here. Today, 16 years ago, after the apology, we are releasing the 2023 Closing the Gap Annual Report and the 2024 Implementation Plan. Much has been said about the Productivity Commission report released last week, and I want to be clear. All levels of government need to do better, as the Prime Minister said, if we are to make progress on closing the gap, all levels. As the Prime Minister also said, this government is committed to the ongoing national agreement on closing the gap. We are determined to work with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Coalition of the Peace on the 4 priority reforms. The first of these is formal partnerships and shared decision-making, the key to self-determination. The second, as well as building the community control sector, which is about community taking responsibility for delivering services people trust, or along with transforming government organisations so they work for everyone. And finally, shared access to data and information so we can make the right decisions together and act on evidence. If we are to get these priority reforms right, we will make progress on the targets. And in recognition of our partnership, I look forward to welcoming the coalition of peaks to meet with the Cabinet in the near future. The same old approach of insisting that government knows best has not worked, and it is in that spirit today the Albanese Labor government announces, as the Prime Minister said, a new jobs program to create 3,000 jobs in remote community, and I can assure the opposition leader it will be delivered. We are replacing the failed community development program with real jobs, proper wages and decent conditions. Starting later this year, the new jobs program, which will be developed in partnership with First Nations people. Everyone, this will be life-changing for many people in remote communities. The old CD program was a failure. We all acknowledge that. It failed individuals and failed communities. And I thank the Prime Minister for his commitment to this important reform. This is about putting communities in the driver's seat to create local jobs, jobs that will strengthen communities and grow remote economies, jobs that will deliver what communities need and what communities want. And communities have told me they want to access things like laundries, butchers and mechanic shops, and to build up the local skills that are needed for the care economy service and maintenance. So there is more work and more opportunity for locals and less reliance on fly-in and fly-out workforces. In the remote community of Gulawinku in the Northern Territory, for example, at the Mayuk kitchen, Yolngu women train and cook meals for people visiting the island. Local woman Rita Gurawi says of the program's success, when you work, you feel better. You have money and you can provide for your family. We're showing a pathway for our children. As well as the new jobs program, we're also investing, as the Prime Minister said, $30 million in remote training hubs in 7 remote communities. The Minister says hear, hear, and hear, hear indeed. $10.7 million to continue funding the Justice Policy Partnership and the rollout of Wi-Fi in 20 remote communities. We've also announced today that we will establish a Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, because the number of children in out-of-home care is unacceptable. 27 years ago, after the Bringing Them Home report, Indigenous children are almost 11 times more likely to be in out-of-home care than non-Indigenous children. And of course, all children, no matter who they are, deserve to be safe. The new Commissioner will work with communities and state and territory commissioners and focus on strengthening families and getting better outcomes for First Nations children and young people. This has come about through the long-running advocacy, some of them in the gallery today, of the Peak Group for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children and Families, and SNAKE, g'day Muriel, who in partnership with frontline experts and the Minister for Social Services has worked so hard. We have been working on the best way to make sure this delivers change for our children. And while we all know the gap is not closing fast enough, there are some rays of hope. I stood here last year and described it as a disgrace that First Nations communities in this country that still do not have reliable access to safe drinking water. We are, as the Prime Minister has said, addressing that through work led by the Minister for the Environment and Water. New Wi-Fi access delivered in remote communities, work led by the Minister for Communications, and work is underway to improve access to renal services in remote communities, work being led by the Minister for Health. Last year in Darwin, and I'll never forget it, I joined Senator Malinda McCarthy with a group of women from remote Borroloola. I'll never forget it. These women were staying in a hostel in Darwin, 900 kilometres from their community, to stay alive, just so they could have access to life-saving dialysis treatment. They cried when we announced that they'd no longer have to make the huge trip from Darwin to Darwin. Borroloola is getting a new dialysis unit as part of our commitment to provide better renal services for First Nations people. With at least 34 chair renal dialysis units across the country, this will make a difference to people's lives. I want to conclude by acknowledging that there is still much hurt in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and across this country after the referendum last October. Of course, it was not the result we hoped for, but as the Prime Minister said, we accept the outcome. And as the Minister for Indigenous Australians, I want to say to First Nations people, I will work with you towards a better future. As the Prime Minister has also said, we are going to take the time required to get Makarrata and truth-telling right, as treaties progress at a state and territory level. To Pat Turner, Catherine Little and Scott Wilson, I can see some of you up there in the gallery. That's it, the gallery. Thank you for your hard work, your wisdom, but most importantly, your determination. Thank you so much. I am looking forward to continuing to work with the Coalition of Peace to close the gap and deliver a better future for First Nations people across Australia, always working in the spirit of self-determination. I will conclude today with the words of our Grand Lady, Dr. Lowitja O'Donoghue, as relevant today as they ever were. Lowitja said, "We are all here now and we have to solve our differences and live together as Australians. Together we can build a remarkable country, the envy of the rest of the world."
The question is that the House take note of the document. And I give the call to the Honourable the Deputy, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister, the Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Opposition Leader. I also want to acknowledge those here today who've made the journey to our nation's Parliament on this important occasion. I'm delivering this statement on behalf of our Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and Senator for the Northern Territory, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price. The Opposition notes that this annual report was only made available a short time ago, and while we welcome the progress that appears to have been made in some areas, some outcomes have worsened. There is still plenty of work to be done, and we hope that a deeper look into the findings will illustrate how the gap exists differently in different parts of the country. Mr Speaker, today we once again stand here in this place and talk about closing the gap. The term has been so enmeshed in our national lexicon that the gap is now fused in the minds of millions with Indigenous disadvantage. Perhaps when we first envisaged the term all those years ago, we did not anticipate that we would once again be standing here today with that gap still clear and present. Indeed, closing the gap has become almost euphemistic. We refer to the gap when really what we are talking about is the lived experience of a group of Australians who die younger, are assaulted and sexually abused more often, and are trapped in the cycle of poverty and despair. We talk about the gap when really we are talking about real people, real Australians, living their lives here in our country. We should question this language, Mr Speaker, because today we are confronted not with a gap, but with a chasm. We are confronted by a chasm of life expectancy, a chasm of domestic violence, a chasm of despair, and a chasm of opportunity. Bridging that chasm will require much more than another statement in this place. Bridging that chasm will require more than another report or another program, as important as that work may be. Bridging that chasm will require us to change the way we approach these seemingly intractable issues, and that, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what our Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians has done. As she notes, this annual report and the 3-year review of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap released last week comes at a critical period of time for Indigenous affairs in Australia. We have arrived as a nation at a new juncture when it comes to the area of social effort. Now is not the time to sit back. Now is the time for new, practical action. Because we must address disadvantage where it exists, not at a simply racial level, but where specific help is needed, because those chasms of opportunity can be found across our nation. We must work with communities at a local level, not to treat all Indigenous Australians as one homogenous group. Mr. Speaker, on this point, we should note the hard work and considered words of the member for Barara, who said in a similar speech before the referendum that there are already significant Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices out there that are talking to government, and governments need to listen to those voices. He continued, listening to the experiences is what partnership in closing the gap is all about. We note the contributions of the 10 other Indigenous members of Parliament, including, of course, Senator Nampijinpa Price. The Federal Parliament has currently 11 elected Indigenous members and senators, but it's important to remember that the experiences of the nearly 1 million Indigenous Australians vary dramatically between each other. Indeed, those 11 members in our Parliament appear in both houses from parties right across the political spectrum and represent 5 of the 7 Australian states and territories. If the target of closing the gap is to be reached, if we are to bridge that chasm, we must do away with the idea that there exists a silver bullet, a one-size-fits-all solution to Indigenous disadvantage, a remedy that will work just as well for someone living in remote Australia as it will for someone in a capital city. This requires a restart of sorts, a fundamental rethink of our approach to Indigenous disadvantage that begins with a closer look at the organisations and bodies that exist right now with the purpose of closing the gap. Natalie Siegel-Brown, Commissioner of the 3-year review, said recently that, to date, most government actions and plans to implement the agreement relabel business as usual or simply tweak existing ways of working. The agreement, the Commissioner continues, can and should be a blueprint for real reform, but governments will need to move beyond business as usual and address the entrenched attitudes, assumptions and ways of working that are preventing progress. Today we mark 15 years since the first Closing the Gap report was tabled, yet Aboriginal on Aboriginal violence remains an all too real problem. On the streets of Alice Springs, throughout the Northern Territory and across the country, extreme rates of domestic violence within Indigenous households are devastatingly high. Drug and alcohol abuse all too common, children often abused, sexually assaulted, treated in unthinkable ways. Education rates are low. Traditional owners struggle in their fight to use their own land for economic opportunity, and as we have seen recently, organisations and individuals exploit them for personal gain. In the face of these challenges, we cannot allow ourselves to be frozen in a state of indecision. Now is the time to take new practical action and bring greater focus to this critical area, because clearly something is not working. It is the view of the opposition that only a thorough audit of those organisations will reveal what that is, and conversely, where some groups are having success that might be emulated. Only a royal commission into Indigenous child sexual abuse will reveal the full extent of the problem and what we must do to put an end to it. Accountability and transparency are fundamental to the approach that Australians have asked us to take in addressing Indigenous disadvantage, and it is accountability and transparency that must form the basis of this next stage. Each year, members of this Parliament rise to speak about closing the gap, and yet the chasm persists, Mr. Speaker. We celebrate the few targets that appear to be on track, while lamenting too many targets that aren't being reached. We need to make this year different. We must use this opportunity not simply to mark another report, but to mark a new approach, a fundamental rethink of the current method, a questioning of the premise from which we launch our fight for real change and an end to the separatism that has characterised our approach thus far. But it will require a clear-eyed examination of our existing public policy and a renewed focus on practical action in every corner of this country. It is our hope and our belief that we can achieve this together.
Yeah.